All right, folks, let's get started. Please grab a seat. We have 2 more talks, and then the panel discussion, and then lunch. So first up, we have Matthias Cape, who's a marine biogeochemical scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. And he has a long history in biological oceanography, and especially in phytoplankton ecology in the polar regions, which has nothing to do with what we'll be talking about today. But he'll tell you about the work that he's been doing and why that expertise is highly applicable to what he's doing now. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually, well, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and learn so much and hear so much about the mesopelagic. It's actually fun for me on a personal level because the last time I stood here, I was a summer student fellow 18 years ago giving a talk. And I've done a few things since then, but in that time I was studying fish, modeling though. And now I'm back talking about fish here again, with brief stint or long stint in the polar regions in the meantime. All right, let's get going. So what I'll be talking about today is looking at the mesopelagic through a different lens, and really that's the length of climate change and climate mitigation, looking at the role of the mesopelagic and carbon sequestration in the oceans, potential interventions having to do with the mesopelagic that might move the needle in terms of climate mitigation, again in the mesopelagic, and looking at the way forward when we're thinking about the mesopelagic and the benefits and the role it plays in the ecosystem, potentially for carbon and carbon sequestration, but also taking into account human needs and where the integral of all these are going to bring us forward in time when we're thinking about potential management of the mesopelagic. There's no one given answer there, but I'll provide a roadmap and some ideas of where to go forward from there. So the background to this is if we're going to keep, the climate change and the temperature change by the mid-century to 1.5 to 2 degrees, ideally 1.5, there's going to be a number of interventions that are necessary to do so, in addition to the deployment of green technologies and conventional abatement technologies. Primary, first and foremost, is the decrease of carbon emissions, which you'll see in this brown area right here. Limiting and decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. The other one is a big role played by natural systems in taking up CO2. And the last one is this negative emissions technologies. You might have heard about CDR, carbon dioxide removal technologies. They are equivalent. But all these are necessary, and the natural climate or the natural component is very important in that it is taking up a large component or a large amount of carbon and may be enhanced and or mitigated or conserved to do more so in the future. But it is part of most projections in the IPCC, all projects in the IPCC, that natural systems are very important to our future scenarios of climate change. And when we consider the role of natural systems in greenhouse gas mitigation, we often use in EDF and more broadly this term natural climate solutions. There's strategies to avoid greenhouse gas emissions, sequester carbon from the atmosphere by either protecting, managing, restoring, or enhancing ecosystems. These natural climate solutions really exist on a spectrum, with at the end these natural climate solutions restoring coral, essentially seaweed stands, protecting natural pathways through carbon sequestration, and on the other end these negative emission technologies which might be more engineered. You can think about direct air capture, direct ocean capture, and enhanced weathering and things like this. In the future, to meet the needs of mitigation, we'll have to have an assortment of these potential interventions in the ecosystem, in the environment. And what I'll talk about specifically here is the natural climate solutions aspect of these things. When we think about more broadly in policy and climate strategy and goals, how this can be incorporated, one pathway that countries can use is through these natural determined contributions. They're really climate pledges in which countries kind of determine which pathways and what strategies they're going to adopt to meet climate mitigation needs and adaptation needs, which are backed with some kind of financial support, some pathway to actually achieve these mitigation strategies. And carbon crediting and carbon markets, in which we're actually assigning some kind of credit value to either to activities that either reduce emissions or increase sequestration of carbon, and that these can get traded to different actors, can be an important part of this. But for these and have a certain amount of benefits which are listed there, But for these credits to be valuable and useful in the future, they need to be of high integrity. And one issue there, which I'll come back to later in the talk, is that their ability and the amount of carbon they sequester, the amount of time that they sequester it, and the risk of which for which this carbon can be re-released in the environment are very important to be able to, for them to be counted as carbon credits for all natural systems. And for the ocean especially, if we think of it as a three-dimensional environment moving in time with issues with sampling, as we've heard, and things like this, it is quite challenging to be able to get quantifiable information in terms of this, what the carbon stocks are and how we move them through the ocean. So moving from this, so what we're talking about in the ocean specifically when we're thinking about NCS is this idea of blue carbon. And you might have heard blue carbon in many different settings. It's typically used to refer to salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. Traditionally, these coastal ecosystems that take up carbon, well known. There's actually carbon and crediting efforts in these spaces that are ongoing. It's a rather long-term project in that space. But more recently, there's been interest in cultivated seaweed systems, restoring or enhancing growth of cultivated seaweeds along the coast, and as well as ocean systems. And when we think about ocean systems, we're thinking about the role of marine biota in moving carbon around in the ocean and the volume and the magnitude of which this is being sequestered. As well as another important component which I won't talk about is the sediments. Sediments and the role of sediments as storage of carbon and potential re-release through human activities with this little fishing boat. So we've been talking today about, and yesterday about, the mesopelagic biomass, the interactions in the ecosystem, but the mesopelagic also interacts with human needs and human life on this planet. So there's growing pressures on the marine environment to provide not only this ecosystem surface of carbon, as I'm arguing here, and then its role for the ecosystem, but also used as a source of food for the planet. As human population grows and needs of protein grow, we turn to the ocean and capture fisheries to be able to feed the planet. The capture fisheries have stagnated and aquaculture is taking off to be able to meet the protein needs of the planet. But these two systems are not mutually exclusive in that some of the capture fisheries, like anchovette, are actually used to produce fish meal and fish oil, which then go back to aquaculture feed aquaculture. And so there's this tension between the human needs for direct consumption of food and then the aquaculture needs for these intermediate products. And as we'll see and we'll argue, these resources that we're using capture fisheries to produce the fish meal and fish oil used in aquaculture are also undergoing rapid variability and potentially decline. Here an example from this year where the anchoveta fishery in Peru was closed in the early season, leading to decreases in fish meal production. From Peru alone, a global decrease is about 10%. And so we're looking into the future and the goals of the UN Decade of Ocean Science and thinking about the role of aquaculture and the need to feed the planet. This is a big issue. And one pathway to alleviate this issue is potentially a new fishery on mesopelagics, which would fill that void and potentially use as a new source of fish meal and fish oil. And so it's really the interaction of this environmental components, natural component of the human system that is kind of going to dictate the future of the mesopelagic. So going back to, again, what the EDF and what we've been working on in the last few years, what we were working with the Bezos Earth Fund and internally at EDF, what we wanted to do is in the open ocean space, quantify the readiness for different carbon sequestration pathways in the ocean. And these are the primary ones we studied. Again, I'll focus on the mesopelagic fishes. But the context is we wanted to quantify the carbon sequestration potential of these different pathways, knowns and unknowns and data gaps and uncertainties. Not only this potential risk and benefits of harvesting both the humans and to the natural systems. And ultimately, the last bullet point here is if we scale these pathways to actually move the needle to climate, to decarbonization, what are the socioeconomic and political contexts and impacts that might result from it? And so is this a pathway that's ready for things like carbon credit and carbon market and incorporating in national strategies for carbon mitigation? So a couple of slides here for context. And these have been recently, this paper has been recently submitted by Jamie Collins and co-authored. Jamie Collins was graduate students here, I believe, at WHOI. And so this slide gives the context here on the X is the estimated biomass of these different components, all ocean biota, whales, mesopelagic fishes, and all marine fishes in petagrams. This represents a meta-analysis of any published papers that exist in the space. You'll see that there's quite a large range for any of these components, with mesopelagic fishes going up to 25 petagrams globally and down to some fraction of a petagram. This variability reflects both uncertainty in calculations. For example, this high-end estimate is based on conversion of acoustic biomass, or acoustic returns from a ship, EK80 or something similar, to an amount of fish, which is uncertain. And some of these are also resulting from models. So there's a large variety of approaches to quantify this, and uncertainty within each approach, knowing that globally the mesopelagic is undersampled, which we've heard about today, and we keep hearing about, I think, as a theme. So this is the biomass, but what we're really thinking about in carbon sequestration are fluxes, movement of carbon up and down. And so this is another figure summarizing literature values and what's known of this. I'll orient you a bit. Both of these map the same amount, which is the carbon export flux from the surface ocean in petagrams carbon per year. The top graph on the y-axis is on a log scale. The bottom is linear. And this is so it's better able to show kind of the variability amongst these different components. I'll focus on mesopelagic, but as you can see, if on a linear scale, some would not even make it, or not very much comparable. But if we think about the carbon flux on the mesopelagic, we can look here at this linear scale. It's somewhere on the order of 1 to 3 petagrams carbon per year. If we think about that flux, that's on par with US emissions in a single year. So it's rather large. And so if we're thinking about the impact of potential fisheries or human activities that touch this, we might impact or fishing of the mesopelagic might lead to greater impact of release of emissions on the scale of something about the US emissions. It's very large. Potentially large footprint. So the scale, both of the biomass and the fluxes that are mediated by the mesopelagic, would argue for some kind of conservation of the mesopelagic in the present. It really would amount to avoided CO2 emissions because there's no fishing activity at the moment. The natural cycle is perpetuating. There's some small scale fisheries potentially, but it could support US emission goals in avoiding further CO2 emissions. Moratorium on any fishing or any activity in the ocean that touches the mesopelagic will allow time for better understanding the mesopelagic, including some of these fascinating food web connections and connections between mesopelagic and higher predator in the epipelagic zone that we've heard about today. And it presented an opportunity to, much like the OTZ project, JETZON, or the MESO project in the EU, to better understand the mesopelagic on a regional scale and build towards global scale understanding before we do any human activity in the region. As well as, I think Anna's speaking tomorrow, but also understand not only what we know now, but also explore what are the broader implications of potentially mesopelagic. We've looked into the diversity, and I'm talking now about the carbon pump and carbon sequestration aspects of mesopelagic. But there are the things that we just heard about this morning from Cameron about the apex predators, the relationship between their dynamics, their behavior, and what's happening in the mesopelagic that need to be expanded upon, along with other potential avenues. So after this thorough review and collaboration with a panel of experts, some of whom are sitting in this room, we think EDF, and that's the argument that we place in this Collins et al. Paper, that mesopelagic conservation is intervention that's ready for implementation in the present. And we've had discussions with ICs and different governing bodies in terms of what that really would mean, and that's the advice that we presented internationally. And it's really a low risk intervention. There's no attempt to modify the natural process. All we're saying is to leave it be in the present. It's relatively low cost because there's currently no fishery associated with it, so we're not asking people to shift anything in their behavior. And so the cost of this is relatively low. There may be a lost opportunity for fishing and livelihoods, but currently there isn't a large-scale fishery, so this is relatively minimized. And what I'm providing here is some scale. We're thinking about this in terms of the flux of carbon, but we also need to take into account these different social contexts and human contexts. And so so there isn't necessarily lost livelihood, but there is a big issue in governance, because currently the governance is non-existing for the mesopelagic. There's only, I think, one treaty or one piece of policy globally that mentions the word mesopelagic. And so it's very hard to potentially to enforce any ban or any moratorium on mesopelagic fishing. And the other part that I already mentioned and alluded to is this demand for fish meal and fish oil. If there's a demand that's increasing, it might be hard to actually enforce and or push forward implementation of any moratorium if the demand is there. Another issue that potentially will come up later is that mesopelagic is really only a layer of the ocean that's considered by scientists, like many of us in the room, or companies that are trying to use it as a resource. Most people don't interact with the mesopelagic zone. The WHOI OTZ project has done excellent work in trying to advertise and communicate this work. But really on a day-to-day, I would argue that most people don't really have a concept for it. And so if we're looking for social acceptance for policy and social support, it might be very difficult. So this is one pathway forward in terms of just a moratorium on the short term. But what I started with thinking about is this carbon crediting. Can we put it as an official piece of climate mitigation that countries can use to fit it within carbon crediting framework? And these are different dimensions that we're considering and when we're considering the ability for this to happen. And our conclusion and the conclusion of the research that we work with, it is not ready for high quality carbon credits. High quality being the key words there, because while we know an order of magnitude on the biomass and the carbon fluxes for the mesopelagic, we don't know it to an extent that we can certify that a body of water at this depth in this region contributes to an X amount of flux that will stay in the water for X amount of time in terms of CO2. And that's the level of detail we need to get to for this. And actually, most of this carbon dioxide removal technologies where we will need to, in the monitoring, reporting, verification framework, figure out very reliably where this carbon is, how long it's staying down, and how long it's going to be there. So for now, it is not in that space, but meetings like this and collaboration among scientists and development of new technologies, new observation technologies that we heard this morning, modeling frameworks that incorporate new observation are a pathway forward for this. So now if we're looking forward to what the future of the mesopelagic might be, and looking at more the natural meets human element about what can we do then? What would a policy look like that balances the human needs, so potentially nutrition, fisheries, and otherwise, and also the conservation aspect of things. And what are the contours of what a good policy, quote unquote, should address for the mesopelagic? And I'll start that investigation by showing some pictures of actual fish as opposed to just diagrams. And so these are three species of fish that have been considered for exploitation in different parts of the world. There's a regional context in this that some, as is known currently, are rather globally distributed, like Morollicus. Some are more regional, like Benthosema and Bensigera. Some are limited to the North Atlantic or Atlantic, and some more in the Pacific. And so when we're thinking about how we would go forward with any policy or any work in terms of regulating, sustainably managing these, there's a global context as well as a regional context in which the resource is located within potentially EEZs of certain countries that have certain needs and certain approaches to ocean management, as well as the high seas, which is another way and another pathway for governance. And the ability to govern these regions and sustainably manage this resource in different regions of the world might be very different. And later on top of this, when we think about the blue economy, that's really any economy, any economic activity that touches upon the ocean. It really goes beyond just thinking about whether it's economically viable and how much we can extract from it and at what price. But really, when you think about blue economy in a more holistic sense, there's other dimensions like environmental sustainability of an economic activity in the ocean, whether it's culturally appropriate for its region and where it's occurring, and whether it's focused on social equity and well-being. And so the capacity to develop as a pelagic fishery, looking at these different components, is at the present relatively low. If we look at this, this is not in specific mesopelagic context, but more globally at a blue economy, and trying to rate, from the light blue to the dark blue, the blue economy capacity of different regions of the ocean. One thing you'll notice is the high seas is the lowest, and that's where we might have a lot of the mesopelagic resources. But also there's some variability in terms of even within the EZs, and that's based on differences within the economic viability in some of these dimensions, and also the government framework, which is listed there explicitly. So what are we doing to really understand moving forward if we're thinking about making a plan as to how we're going to meet conservation needs, incorporate this carbon ecosystem service, carbon sequestration ecosystem service into some kind of policy, and also meet the needs for human nutrition. And so really what we're focused on at EDF is taking the science and trying to move towards action. What can we do to move the needle either within climate mitigation specifically or other pathways? And so the pathway that we're chosen is to start with kind of a system mapping approach. And that's mapping the human natural system that's associated with the mesopelagic. So everything the mesopelagic could touch, and we'll develop this. What are the interacting composite processes as an entry point for where can we actually make a difference in managing the mesopelagic? Another component of this is identify the actors, who's involved, what are the stakeholders in this space, and drivers of their behavior. And that's something that's ideally done, co-produced with the actors themselves, and meeting with them and discussing what they are actually doing in the mesopelagic and why. To ultimately identify leverage points for maximum impact. So this is something that's been going on for quite a while, but these different, what I'm going to present to you is you know, akin to kind of a food web, but incorporating a human component. And this is work that's done in collaboration with SIMFO, and it's really looking at this human natural system and what touches the mesopelagic. And at the root of it, where I started the talk discussing the mesopelagic, is it's really related to our needs for protein and fishing. And so the growth in human population sizes, globalization, need for protein is really driving a demand for fish, which is impacting wild fishing stocks. But this ability to fish is really providing for food security, livelihood, and economic output. But there are some other sides that are potentially impacting the environment and impacting the way we actually harvest these. One is because of the growing need, there's a lot of power in the fishing industry, potentially impacting the policies that are set in place that are governing and regulating the fisheries. And so one issue in that space is potential economic subsidies that subsidize fisheries that are otherwise not economically viable without them. So we're starting to move resources from the ocean that artificially are economically viable because of these subsidies, which kind of feeds back again on the policy framework and the demand for fish. If we're moving one step over, if we expand this to look at what the problems are, and this is the base case status quo. This is not saying we're changing anything. This is kind of where we're at, and in an effort to find potential levers for change. You know, the demand for wild fish is impacting through overfishing, fishing stocks, which feeds back on the available fish to actually feed the planet and this cycle. So one bypass, which and one other pathway where I started with, is to augment the fish stocks, this ability to actually grow fish and through aquaculture, which again increases food security and livelihood and economic output, apart from the fact that some of this aquaculture is diverted for feed, which impacts fish stocks. We're having this kind of cycle in which we're trying to find an alternative for wild fish, but then wild fish actually being used and negative impacting stocks. The demand for feed is specifically limiting the growth of the aquaculture industry, large variabilities, and so there might be need to find alternatives, which fishing on mesopelagics might provide. But if expanding on mesopelagic fishes, we might end up in the same scenario, which we are with wild capture fisheries, if overfishing impacting the stocks, which might then again feed back on the ability of the mesopelagic to actually fulfill its the carbon sequestration role. Impacts on climate change biodiversity loss, which again might feed back on the fish stocks through these food web relationships that we heard about this morning. We'll continue to hear about. This paints a bit of a bleak picture when you look at it like this, but the reason to create these kinds of diagrams is to look at potential pathways for change. Where in this map can we make a difference? And this is why these are created. And so we can also use these diagrams to dream what would an ideal scenario in the future look like, who we need to talk to and who we need to work with to make that happen. So for example here, if we are able to develop sustainable aquafeeds that don't necessarily rely on wild capture fisheries, we might remove these feedbacks from harvesting a wild fish and demand for feed on fish stocks, both mesopelagic and epipelagic. If we're able to do that, then that might alleviate some of the pressure. And then another component that's going to be very important, I hope we get to talk about, is this new government system that potentially explicitly acknowledges and addresses the mesopelagic, but also more broadly in terms of the fisheries, take into account this blue carbon, the carbon sequestration rule for fisheries, which is something that's not done anywhere right now. Being talked about, but currently, the harvesting is, or the management is primarily for yield and not any ecosystem service at all. So how do we grow that out to be able to benefit the fish stocks, both in the epipelagic and the mesopelagic? So to finish off here, just some conclusions. So on the near term, what we think is more prescient is a moratorium on fishing for the mesopelagic. And it's based on this large magnitude of carbon flux the mesopelagic facilitates. There's a low risk of adverse impact on livelihoods, given that there really isn't a fishery at the present, and it's really low cost. So it's a very easy entry point for this work at the present. The pathway is not ready for high quality carbon credits in the present. It lends itself to scalability, but really needs to quantify this pathway better to be able to incorporate it in NDCs and other things. And really mapping the system, including both human and natural component, is really a way to find entry points into making a change in this pathway, both for essentially mesopelagic fish, but also epipelagic fish predators that we're talking about, and all these different components of the ecosystem that are touching the mesopelagic. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And
I think if it's okay, we're going to hold questions for the time being, and then we'll do the panel and get everybody back together. So next up is Matt Woodstock joining us from Morgan State University, and he is actually soon to start a postdoc scholarship here at WHOI in the next month and a half or so. And he has a history of working on organismal functional roles in aquatic ecosystems, and more recently, ecosystem modeling, specifically in the deep sea and the mesopelagic. So thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Matt Woodstock, and today I'm mostly going to discuss how we can leverage data, and particularly food web data, for holistic purposes. And then I'm going to use a lot of my dissertation work, which was in the Gulf of Mexico, as examples, and then lead into some thoughts about how I feel that we can improve on those efforts. So a lot of people to thank. Modeling is not done in a vacuum. So particularly the Deep End team, and then my PhD advisor, Yuying Zhang. And when I'm talking about food web modeling, I'm mostly talking about the intersection between population dynamics, energetics, and trophic ecology. So the basic concept is that there's several factors that can be influencing the energy flows into and out of a particular population. And a lot of these, like predation pressure, fishing pressure, and consumption rates, are dependent on other species in the system or human involvement. And we typically quantify all of these as rates, which I would classify as some sort of calculation of a process over a unit time. And this allows us to have a standardized value that we can then compare among species or within populations over time. And once we understand these rates and how dynamic they are, we can then forecast those populations over time. And this is the general theory behind a lot of our single species assessment efforts. But a problem that we have with a lot of those efforts in any marine ecosystem, whether it's in the open ocean or not, is that food webs are very complex. A particular population can be influenced by a myriad of predator and prey populations, not to mention the competitive effects of other species. And this makes calculations of energy fluxes difficult, but necessary for us to understand holistic food web processes and to identify the particular predators that are most important for a prey population. Now, complicating this further is that ecosystems are also dynamic. And this means that when we're making those assessments, things like predation mortality, fishing mortality, and consumption rates are also dynamic. So food web modeling is largely an exercise to take all of those species in the system and simulate them all at one time. And the main advantage to this is that we can model predator-prey dynamics and the changing of those magnitudes of those effects. And we can also incorporate seasonal and interannual environmental parameters to get at questions like climate change. And that gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to the type of research questions we can ask, whether they're for ecosystem-based management or any restoration, or for just general scientific inquiry. Now, the open ocean is obviously not immune to the effects of humans, and disturbances that are likely to affect these systems are much more likely to affect entire communities or the entire ecosystem rather than a specific species. Now, one event that we heard a lot about yesterday was the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is kind of the impetus for a lot of my work. And to provide a little bit more detail, that wellhead in the top right was 1,500 meters deep, and there was a plume of oil that stayed around 1,100 to 1,300 meters and persisted there. So this was very much a deep water event. Now, that figure in the bottom right shows the Deepwater Horizon site, as well as all of the active oil and gas platforms and leases in the Gulf of Mexico. And you'll see that there are several leases and active platforms that are seaward of the Deepwater Horizon site, which is a little bit of a problem because you're in deeper water. It's a little bit more of an error-prone process. And there have been oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico since Deepwater Horizon, just at a little bit of a different magnitude. Now, we heard a lot about the effects of this on the food web from Tracy and Heather yesterday, in particular to the decline that we've seen. But to frame this more for my modeling work, I have a few main concepts. Now, one is the idea that zooplankton populations have largely showed to be relatively stable in the long term following the spill. So basically, there was an immediate decline for a lot of those populations, but they recovered very quickly. And over the long term, it seems that they've kind of persisted and are back at the levels that they once were pre-spill. At the same time, it was very unclear how mobile predators, like Cam talked about earlier, would have been affected. But it wasn't really believed that the impact would have been huge, particularly since these predators are mobile and since commercial fishing operations were in a moratorium immediately after the spill as a response. However, as you heard yesterday, we have seen a persistent decline in these populations. And we think this likely has to do with elevated levels of hydrocarbons in the stomachs and eggs of a lot of the mesopelagic fishes, crustaceans, and cephalopods, as this figure showing for 2015 to 2016, and we've continued on with this analysis. So I set out to take a food web modeling approach and to estimate the ecosystem scale effects of those declines on mesopelagic micronectin populations, and what that would do to food web structure. So this is much more of the brick and mortar, develop a model, simulate something, in this case declined mesopelagic populations, and then calculate the trends in diet and food web structure. Now, the second objective was to estimate additional mortality that was likely expressed on these mesopelagic micronectin populations following the spill. And this is much more of a theoretical process, but it was a method for us to estimate the effect of this disturbance in the absence of an empirical method to do so. If that was successful, my objective was to try to project those population trends out through the end of this decade into 2030. So I developed this model using the EcoPath with EcoSim software for the northeast Gulf of Mexico, seaward of the 1,000-meter isobath, which is where we have our mesopelagic data. Now, this model requires information about energetic rates, biomass standing stocks, diets, and fisheries landings to essentially try to account for all of the energy that is flowing throughout the system. So if you imagine there being a pie chart like this for each functional group in our model, and that pie is representing all of the energy that population consumes on an annual rate, all of that energy has to be allocated to a particular process. Now, at the end of this, we have our typical static food web that all of our simulations can be built from. And that's when we can look at this food web diagram that a lot of people really like to see. But there's actually a lot of telling information here. For starters, trophic levels on the y-axis, and there is no x-axis. And each of these nodes is a different functional group, and the thickness of these lines is the predation impact from predator to prey. So it's not just displaying who eats whom, it reflects how much is consumed as well, and those are based on the rates that are in the model. Now, since this talk is titled Lessons Learned, I'm going to pop up some of the more important aspects as such. Now, once we have a food web, we can calculate those energy flows, various network analyses, and you can really go crazy with all of the different results that you can look at here. However, in these models, and this is true for most food web models, they are highly reliant on our trophic data and our biomass. So as Tony alluded to yesterday, we can balance energy food webs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate. So we really need a lot of data feeding into these models to constrain what the potential possibilities of those energy flow webs are. Now, another advantage to having a food web is that there are general rules that a lot of ecosystems should be following. So I recently did a meta-analysis of approximately 200 different ecopath models that are available in an online repository. Each point on this plot is a different food functional group from each of those ecopath models, and they're colored by a different trophic level grouping. Now, the x-axis is the group's biomass, and the y-axis is energy throughput, which is the total amount of energy that a functional group is responsible for ascending up the food web in these models. And you can see that although this is from 200 different models, they're from very different systems, ranging from freshwater systems to open ocean. They were developed by different people, and they're really at a different level of robustness compared to how much data they had. There's a very strong relationship here in biomass and energy throughput, to the point where I would expect to see this in any of the models that I'm developing. Now, these kind of rules of thumb or relationships, among many others that are published in the literature, help us fill gaps when we don't have the information that we necessarily need, but we need to put in a number. And this is obviously a very common problem in the mesopelagic zone, as we've been talking about. Now, additionally, once you have a model, things like this can help be a diagnostic for, are my models actually doing what they're supposed to be doing? And essentially help us put our unknown values at least within the right ballpark when we have those gaps. Now, after that, we can then add time. So this model was simulated through 2018, which at that point was our last year of available mesopelagic data. We've since continued that time series. So EcoSim, which is the time dynamic component of EcoPath, is using foraging arena theory, which is creating nonlinear functional response curves similar to the classic Hollings type 2 and type 3 functional responses shown here. And they're different for each predator. So they can be calibrated in the model, and that actually requires time series data to be able to do that. So having time series data at different trophic levels in your system is incredibly important to developing these models, not just for EcoPath, but for others as well. Now, for our efforts, I forced the mesopelagic micronectin groups to decline to the level at which we saw in our field-derived data. And my main objective was to explore how this decline would influence individual trophic interactions. So to test this, I adapted a network analysis technique called mixed trophic impact, which quantifies the relative top-down and bottom-up impacts that each functional group has on each other, including all of your fisheries and indirect interactions. I took the model output and reconstructed diet and mortality matrices in order to do this analysis, and I did it at each time step so that I could assess whether or not there was a change in a particular trophic interaction over time throughout the simulation. And throughout the simulation, each interaction could either strengthen, weaken, or have no observable change. And overall, we saw that over 1/4 of trophic interactions actually changed when we saw a depleted mesopelagic prey field in our models. However, when one interaction strengthened, another one often weakened. So there's trade-offs that we believe are associated with prey switching. Now, the general trend is that the predators were predicted to become less reliant on the mesopelagic preys and more reliant on epipelagic preys, including juveniles of commercially important species, which obviously could create a cyclical problem when you incorporate commercial fishing into the equation. Now, one question we often get in these predictive modeling efforts is, how legit are they? Will they actually come true? And it's a fair question. So to help answer that, we have to look to other work, particularly when we're in data-limited systems without the availability to just go out and get validation data. Now, since we published that initial paper, a different ecosystem modeling effort in the Gulf of Mexico used an Atlantis model. So Atlantis is a much more complicated framework than EcoPath. It's essentially a biogeochemical model combined with a higher trophic level model. This model was spatially explicit, and it actually covered the entire Gulf of Mexico, but they asked a similar question of what would happen to the food web with a depleted mesopelagic prey field, and they found basically the same result. But notably, that this also affected areas beyond where we saw the spill as well, including on the West Florida Shelf, which is that shaded region, which is a coastal region shallower than the 200-meter isobath. And the lesson that we have here is that having multiple models in a region that are operating under different assumptions and use slightly different equations, and then having them do similar investigations can provide greater confidence in our model results. Now, obviously, field data validating these results would be best, but that is very resource intensive and may not always be a feasible thing for us to do, as we've been discussing. Now, just a few months ago, a population dynamics model for oceanic cetaceans was hot off the press, and this was for the Gulf of Mexico, looking at the populations after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it showed that there was a decline between 1% to 8% of the population sizes of various species, and that ranged based on their dependence on deep pelagic prey. Now, our ecopath model aggregated oceanic cetaceans into 3 different functional groups. We had baleen whales, which weren't included in this analysis, but we also had toothed whales like sperm whales and deep diving beak whales, as well as oceanic dolphins. Now, in our model, our toothed whale functional group was projected to decline at basically the same rate that they're projecting in this paper, but our oceanic dolphin functional group didn't really show a decline. And I think this has to do with the diets that we were putting on our oceanic cetaceans in our model being very epipelagic reliant. They still ate mesopelagic prey, but they weren't as reliant on mesopelagic organisms as the toothed whales in the model. So we think that's why we're seeing this kind of contrasting result. And the lesson we have here is that there's always things that we can change and improve upon in these models, and potentially areas where we have new data or where new information becomes available. So I like to say that these models are never entirely finished. Now, sure, we have to stop sometimes and we have to write manuscripts and write reports and answer research questions, but ultimately these models are a representation of our current understanding of the system and the data we have, and that is constantly changing. So our next step was to try and predict the external sources of mortality that would have been caused by the Deepwater Horizon and expressed by mesopelagic populations, and to use that to more freely forecast how these populations predicted these trends. And as I alluded to, these models are constantly in development. And this project was a couple years after that initial one, and new data had become available. I had formed new collaborations. I had also developed a carbon export model for mesopelagic fishes, which was relying on energetic rates that could have been informed into this future modeling effort. So basically, we were able to slightly adjust some of the input parameters in the initial model, again, refining what we have in our modeling framework. And in this effort, I developed several different iterations of potential mortality regimes to be expressed on our mesopelagic micronectin. These 4 types of mortality regimes included a suite of scenarios where mortality remained constant over time, so essentially acting as a control where mortality just doesn't decrease. A second suite where mortality declined in a stepwise pattern, including the possibility of reaching 0, so it's declining over time. A third where mortality declined as an exponential rate, so it never actually reaches 0, but it gets to a very small amount. And then a fourth mortality regime where mortality kind of declined at a random rate to essentially cover the fact that we don't actually know what the effect of this spill was on our mesopelagic micronectin. So I was really taking a shotgun approach to find any scenario that could produce population trends that would fit within the 95% confidence intervals of our field data for each year. And depending on which mortality shape was and is truly being expressed, we kind of had 2 different stories. One where there's the potential for population recovery by 2030, and a second where populations are really predicted to remain depressed with very little variation among all of the scenarios that fit within our data. And I'm only showing metophids here, but all of our mesopelagic groups showed a similar trend. I'll caveat this by saying that anytime we're predicting population trends, you are putting a lot of faith into the accuracy of the model itself. But as we've collected new data, we are looking into expanding this. And as you saw yesterday, we haven't really seen a recovery of these populations beyond 2011 in the samples that we've had. And although this is somewhat of a backwards approach to modeling, when we're trying to use the model to estimate the effect size of a disturbance, and it's really unknown, I think studies like this are really important because when it comes to understanding the effect of a disturbance in the mesopelagic zone, we often don't really know how that effect is going to continue in the future or how it's really being expressed right now. This is really a piece that, at least in our efforts, have kind of been very well adopted by our end user groups. Now, in addition, last year I wrote a review about ecosystem modeling in the deep sea. So this includes anything deeper than 200 meters. It includes anything that's quantifying energy fluxes from the primary producer to the higher trophic level apex predator groups. And I also had to remove any duplicates, so like dissertation chapters that were later published. Now, to supplement a Web of Science search, which is what I used for this analysis, I also looked in the references section of each of the papers that were brought up to try to supplement as much as I can and catch as much of the work as I could. And the main goal of this was really, one, to collate all of the information that was out there, and then two, to provide thoughts for how I felt existing efforts haven't really been explored. And this led to the accumulation of 304 total publications, the oldest being a chapter from Catherine Green's dissertation from 1975 in the Southern Ocean. There's two lines on this plot, and the top one with that blue gradient is just the cumulative number of studies over time. And that red one is studies that I defined as having a quote-unquote deep sea identifier. So having some instance of the deep sea, so like a mesopelagic group, or mentioning that they're focused on the deep sea in the title or the abstract of the paper. And now what this means is that the majority of models that are including deep sea ecosystems are really focused on other aspects of the ecosystem. And a lot of times you're going to have a quote-unquote mesopelagic functional group, which generally means that all of the mesopelagic animals are being treated as having the exact same life history, the exact same diets, etc. So you're aggregating that group. So you're essentially assuming that there's functional redundancy among all mesopelagic animals or myctophids, where we very well know that there are differences among these animals, and we just don't have the ability to quantify the ecosystem scale effects of those differences. Now, there's a variety of different modeling frameworks out there, but the most common is the EcoPath with EcoSim software by far, which for this talk really only serves to mean that we're often lacking in ability to take multi-model approaches, as I showed earlier, which can help us provide confidence in our model results. And finally, there's spatial disparity in a lot of our modeling effort, with some regions with really no regions with no ecosystem models at all. So Nina Yang yesterday showed a plot of information that was available in the mesopelagic zone, and it basically would overlap pretty well with this plot, where a lot of the areas that haven't really seen models are areas where we don't have a lot of data. But what this does do is leads to potential regional differences in our ability to use ecosystem models as a tool in order to advance towards ecosystem-based resource management if the need so arises. Now, aside from the obvious data limitation problems, I feel that there are several improvements that are necessary for the development to better estimate ecosystem processes in the mesopelagic zone. Now, for the mesopelagic in particular, organisms are much more finely distributed according to depths than they are horizontally on a latitude and longitudinal scale. But most modeling frameworks don't really have a way to incorporate depth at a fine enough scale to really capture diovertical effects that we know exist in a lot of these organisms, whether that be diovertical migration or just the standard this organism occupies a particular depth relative to other species in the system. Now, second is the integration of species-specific traits and their effect on energetics. So modelers often have to aggregate species into broader functional groups as a way to reduce our model complexity. But if we assume that, for example, all myctophids are the same, as I already mentioned, we're missing out on the differences in their life histories, and we can't calculate how those differences actually are influencing energy flows in our systems. Now, third is the use of multiple data types, which we've talked quite a bit about today. The biggest issue for me being trophic data. So feeding relationships in a lot of these models are really reliant on diet matrices, which are usually best configured for gut content analyses. Now, we need to think of ways to use other sources of diet data, like biochemical markers or eDNA or observational data, among all others. And then once we're able to do that, how do we best incorporate the biases in those estimates to really integrate that information to get the most accurate representation of feeding in our models? So that's more of a rhetorical question meant to lead into a lot of the breakout groups that we're going to be doing this afternoon. Now, so I mentioned that I'll be starting a postdoc here at WHOI, and my goal will really be to attack a lot of the ideas that I just mentioned. So I have a poster this evening on the topic, so I won't go into much detail. But the idea is to develop a modeling framework that works as an individual-based model meaning that I'm modeling individuals rather than populations or communities that are aggregated, allowing for more finite size structures of populations and the integration of species-specific traits when we know them. Now, feeding will be set up in this model so that each individual is making choices relative to predator-prey size ratios and prey preference matrices, similar to an electivity matrix for the trophic ecologists in the room, or what plankton modelers will often call a palatability matrix. Essentially, this relaxes the assumption, or relaxes the reliance on particular trophic types, and should allow us to use multiple data types to inform predation in the model so that each predator can choose the prey that they would prefer based on distance, prey preference, and then size ratios. And once we aggregate this for all individuals of a particular population, we should be able to explore various questions like spatial temporal variability in aquatic food webs, as well as identify key species or taxa that may be most relevant for the emergence or ascension of energy up to the apex predators in your system, including your federally protected species and commercially important species currently. Now, to kind of put a bow on why I feel food web modeling is important, we've talked a lot in the Gulf of Mexico after Deepwater Horizon about the fact that, or the idea that science and the availability of resources to do science is often very reactionary. So meaning that it happens after the event. So for example, an oil rig explodes 1,500 meters deep in the Gulf of Mexico. We then get the resources to go out and fish the mesopelagic zone at a regular interval. And although this is just kind of how the world and how funding works, it presents an issue that by the time we learn about a disturbance, the effects of that disturbance are already ongoing. Now, instead, I prefer to advocate more for proactive science, where we try to gain an understanding of the potential effects of a disturbance before they happen in an ecosystem. Now, one tool to do this is food web modeling, particularly to look at those ecosystem scale effects. And there's just a lot of flexibility in using this tool to answer those questions. Now, I hope that some of this was insightful. I want to say thank you for inviting me to speak here today. All of those that have helped in the development of these models and the collection of data to develop them, as well as all the organizations that have funded the collection of these data. And thank you all for listening.
So we have time for a few specific questions for Matt, and then we can do the panel.
Hey, that was a really cool talk. I was wondering, does EcoPath support life stage dependent groups for some of your categories? And then my other question was, how do you most often get your rates for the trophodynamic portion?
Yeah, two good questions. So the first one, the short answer is yes. When you know that there are ontogenetic shifts in diet, for example, or if the adults have different predators than the juveniles, you can set up different age structured classes. And I don't believe there's a limitation on the number of age classes that you can have in an EcoPath model for a particular population. The one consideration that you have to have there is that you are adding more parameters to your model. You're increasing its complexity. So generally people only do that if they have a reason to justify it. Now I would suggest that we always have a reason to justify that, but it's kind of dependent on the data you have. So the second question, we get a lot of our rates from literature, stock assessments, trait databases like FishBase is not the best source for us, but it's kind of what we're reliant on if we have no other literature-based information. And there's certain empirical methods to estimate things like mortality and consumption rates. Again, field data is better, but yeah.
One more specific question for Matt, and then we'll do the panel.
It's so good to see you're looking at individual-based modeling rather than averages and populations, etc. Given that unless there was natural variability in populations, there'd be no evolution or speciation or anything. And I'm wondering about, with the model you're using, how much of this fuzziness or like ranges rather than average values can be incorporated into it?
Yeah, so for EcoPath in particular, and for most modeling frameworks, you can set it up to basically run Monte Carlo analyses. So you can put confidence intervals around each parameter, rerun it 1,000 times or whatever, and then you get a range of uncertainty in your model estimates once you do that. Yeah, that pretty much answers your question. But that is relying on you being able to also understand the confidence intervals around those parameters, which is, in my opinion, pretty lax in a lot of modeling efforts.
All right, well, let's give it up for Matt and then invite all of our speakers from today to join the panel.